Hello, everyone. Welcome back post-coffee. And it's a great pleasure to be here in this room with a fellow South African, Oliver Hermanus, who is I was about to use the dreaded phrase. Oliver said to me, I hate it when I'm described as an award-winning filmmaker, but he is.
Yes.
And whose recent film, Living, starring Bill Nighy, was nominated for 2 Academy Awards. Oliver, when we were talking last night, suggested that I introduce him as a colored South African filmmaker, and pointed out quite rightly that for the 2 of us, in a South African context, that word is simply a factual one. It designates a racial category and an identity, a cultural identity. But in most other places in the world, that word does not mean that. It has other connotations that are demeaning or derogatory. And so actually I thought it was it was an interesting proposition, which I haven't quite lived up to. But I thought I'd ask Oliver to talk about a colored identity and in the South African context, and the way in which that feeds into your work.
So my race is a colored person. That's the racial designation that I identify as, and that's the product of apartheid. It was a name given to the group of people that were ultimately the product of the intersection between colonization and violence, really, because South Africa, in terms of its genesis as a country, is the product of the Dutch East India Company coming through the Cape and creating a sort of interracial
in the late 17th century.
In the late 17th century, yes.
Yeah.
And so I am somehow a mix of all of that. And the word colored is a word that was sort of applied to my race. And ever since I've been working as a filmmaker, I've had to deal with explaining it all over the world. Even in the New York Times, as we did once, it had to be kind of fact-checked, and there had to be lots of your legal team got involved a bit in making sure that they wouldn't be sued for putting the word in the newspaper. So it is what I am in terms of how I identify, but even that term, I guess, is up for debate, and a lot of people of my race don't like to be called that word, and so there is a conversation about.
It was an apartheid categorization.
Yeah, because it feels like it's a word that is owned by someone else as a description of my race. But I think it's a personal choice now. Like my brother and I have a very healthy debate about how we self-identify. So it's a choice, and I still choose to be identified that way as a filmmaker.
Because it's a cultural identity too.
Yes.
It's not just a racial one.
It is, yes.
Can you talk a bit about how that has, if it has, fed into your filmmaking? I mean, your first film, Shirley Adams, is set within a colored community.
Yes, obviously South Africa is a multitude of cultures and races and languages, and when I made my first film, it felt natural to make a piece of work about what I knew most instinctively, and that was my own sort of textural culture and characters from a place that was recognizable to me, where I grew up in Cape Town. And when I finished that film, which was about a colored mother in the slums of Cape Town whose son is the victim of a gang shooting, and he's rendered a tetraplegic, and the film takes place after that, and it's about the destruction of that family because of the lack of the public health system in South Africa to be able to provide for that family. But when I finished that film, I had the very strong impulse to make something about white people in South Africa, in a way that so many films have been made about South Africans or people of my race, I guess, or culture by white people from America or England. I had the impulse to sort of subvert that and make a piece of work as a colored person about white society in South Africa. And on top of that, wanted to make a film about repression. And so I made this film called, in Afrikaans, it's in Afrikaans, it's called Skoonheid, which means beauty in English. When that film premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, it was kind of a volatile reaction because one, it's a very graphic film about sexual violence, but the other thing was there was this real backlash in South Africa because it was, how dare I make a piece of work about white South Africa as a non-white person.
And that was true too for Moffie, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yes.
And then I doubled down on that and made another film about white South Africans during apartheid in the army, and that was an even stronger reaction.
Can you talk a bit about the subject of, well, I'll explain the subject of Moffie, which is about a young conscript. The film is set in '83, I think,
yes.
The year of Oliver's birth. When at that time, all South African white men had to go to the army for 2 years. It was obligatory, and the film is about a young white young man. He's 18 who goes to the army, goes to what was called basic training, the first 6 weeks or 2 months, something like that, a couple of months anyway.
6 months, yeah.
And his experience, and it is partly about his discovery of his sexuality, but not exclusively. It's also about a lot of other things: repression, shame,
toxic
masculinity. But I remember when I interviewed you for the New York Times piece that we did on Moffie, you said that your mother's reaction when you said you were going to do it was something like, does the world need another story about,
white men,
poor white men?
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
I mean, my family was oppressed under the apartheid regime with a sort of, I'm the generation of South Africans that benefited from. I was born during apartheid, but I've lived most of my life outside of apartheid. But I was that first generation to go to university, even high school, post-apartheid. So I was that front runner in a sense. And so for my family, everything that I've done has been a first in a way, and there's been a lot of pressure that comes with that. We actually call it apartheid tax. Where your parents wanted, all of our parents wanted us to be doctors and lawyers and accountants because they could never go to university, they could never really finish high school. So there was this huge pressure to become very middle class. And so being a filmmaker was not my father's favorite idea. But on top of that, when I said that I was going to make a film set during apartheid, I was going to make a film about white men as potential victims of the system, because they were indoctrinated into the army, and that was just a very difficult challenge for my mother, who would have preferred I'd made a film about Nelson Mandela. Yes, yes, exactly. We've sort of jumped ahead to Moffie, but I did want to ask you about how you got started as a filmmaker, which is very interesting. I mean, you were actually a photographer, a newspaper photographer, and one thing I did want to say is that I didn't want to set up the conversation as your films as kind of political acts, because I think your films are, and you've talked about this, much more acts of portraiture, and almost an extension, as you, I think, once said in one early talk, of the impulse to capture a moment and yes.
make it, the film makes that moment larger, more expansive.
Yes, when I was working as a press photographer, which I sort of stumbled into working at the newspaper in Cape Town, that was a real education. It was a real baptism by fire, because there's a real pressure when you're working at a press agency to get the front page, basically, to make sure you get the right photograph and to learn how to take photographs that tell a story, one photograph. And that became really, unbeknown to me at the time, it became incredibly helpful in the prospect of making films, because it's the same act, really. My films are ultimately portraiture. Even the thing that I'm doing right now, which is not a film, it's a television series, which I'm still shooting in England, is in a way a portrait of a historical figure that history has ignored and has not been given a moment to be known, although we're taking lots of license with all of that. But I do think about filmmaking and storytelling as portraiture, and I think the work that I've done so far has just been a collection of journeys with characters in different situations.
can you say a little bit more perhaps about each of your films? You've done 5 films, is that right?
Yes.
Five films. Maybe could you talk us through the sort of the ways in which the portrait is made in each, what the portrait is of, and what your is there a central thread of interest in those?
Yes, I mean, my first film is a portrait of a mother in a very compromised situation, a very poor woman in a very poor context in South Africa. That's Shirley Adams. My second film, which is Beauty, is definitely a portrait of a repressed white Afrikaans man living in the center of South Africa who's full of secrets and latent violence. My third film is the portrait of a colored waitress in a small town at the coast of South Africa who's the victim of a farm land violence. Morphe, my fourth, is the portrait of a conscript during the 1980s in apartheid. Living, which is the first film I made in England, is a portrait of a man who's dying of cancer and wonders for the first time whether he's lived at all.
And it's a remake of the Kurosawa.
And it's a remake of the Kurosawa film.
So that was a big shift for you to go from a South African context into completely another one. Why did you want to do it?
I got a phone call from Kazuo Ishiguro, the novelist, famed novelist, and he was like, "Look, I want to make a movie. We want to make Living. It's a film that's a remake of a Kurosawa film, which is originally called Ikaru, but I want to set it in England. And we saw your film Morphe, and we'd like you to direct it." And I said no initially because it just felt like a fool's errand to take on Kurosawa as a giant of cinema. But I eventually realized that I wanted to do it and met with the producers and the studio and all of that. And then here we are.
Oliver, I wanted to ask also about the project that you have at the moment, Mary and George. I don't know how much you are able to talk about it, but it's, again, that's a complete departure. It's your first time working in television.
Yes. It's interesting because Mary and George is a commercial piece of work for a studio and very much entertainment, but at the same time it is a piece of work about a historical figure whose name is Mary Villiers, who infiltrated the British monarchy with her son to kind of take over a large portion of favor with the King, James I. And the decision to make the TV show was based on the fact that she was completely underwritten in history as a woman who was in a way very powerful, and we're just having a lot of fun with it. Julianne Moore is playing Mary, who's an extraordinary American actress. And yeah, we hope people will like it when they see it. What's the experience of working in television like compared to film? Terrible. Television is different to film. Television has changed the way that we work today. Television has become the space for narrative. It's become the space for long character stories. Television has become such a different beast because of streamers, and so there's a real appetite for filmmakers to work in television now because you get to actually tell stories in longer formats with lots of money, and that has meant that a lot of us are attracted to it. But it's also it's faster to make that, and it's a big machine. And weirdly, there's a lot of competition. There's a lot of people are watching so much content these days, and there's only so much content one person can watch in a year. And every week, most of the streamers are releasing entire hours and hours of more content for you to watch. And people, they have their favorites, and so to stand out in that market is really, really difficult. Can we backtrack and talk about how you actually became a filmmaker? It's an interesting story, and your path to that. I remember you saying in the interview, the Morphe interview, that there was a moment at which you knew you wanted to make films and couldn't see how, as a coloured man in South Africa, you were ever going to do that, and then something happened. But you told the story. And perhaps if you could talk a little bit about growing up and the context that you grew up in. I mean, I was born into a family in Cape Town who, my parents were political people, and we moved a lot as kids for political reasons. And so I grew up kind of on the road. And as I was saying earlier, because of the nature of where I'm from and my background and the politics of South Africa at the time, having a desire to be a filmmaker or even a photographer, I guess, would have been fantasy. Because there was no real way you could do that. The political system did not allow for somebody like me to really have dreams as a young person. But then the system changed in the early 90s, and by 95, Mandela was the president, and then it kind of completely flipped, and then it was about you can't dream big enough. But that's a lot of pressure, and so I pursued a desire for filmmaking that my mother definitely instilled in me, but it still felt very impossible, a bit like trying to be an astronaut but failing at maths kind of thing.
Did you see a lot of movies growing up? I mean, was that the origin?
My dad would show us lots of banned. The movies that were banned in South Africa were very odd. You know, they would ban things like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and so those were the films. If it was banned, my father wanted to see it because it felt like an act of protest. And so at the time, I'm sure some of you remember Betamax cassettes, tapes. My dad would bury those in the garden once we saw them. And so that was a sort of understanding that cinema could be an agent of social change, because my parents enjoyed watching banned illegal films because it felt like they were somehow protesting. And I think that's part of my brain, I think, as a reason why I like telling stories, is because it feels like an opportunity to communicate. And when I went to film school, which I was able to go to through a private scholarship that I stumbled upon in London. Do
you want to tell the story of how you stumbled upon that?
Roland Emmerich?
Yes.
Yes. I randomly met a very famous filmmaker in Cape Town, a German-American filmmaker who was in South Africa to make a film, and I was working as a press photographer at the time, and he took such a great interest in the work that I was doing, and another photographer, we were taking photographs, and he subsequently encouraged me a lot. He and his director of photography encouraged me a lot to go to film school, because they could see I wanted to be a filmmaker, and then eventually said that, you know, if you get into a film school of your choice that was of worth, that he would subsidize, he'd pay for it, and he did, and then he executive produced my first feature. So I spent a lot of time doing master classes at film schools and always saying to film students that success in the film business is the intersection between preparation and luck, in a way, because somebody can come along in your life and ask you, you know, if you want to be a filmmaker, do you have a script, or what do you want to do? And if you can answer that question, if you have a plan, you never know who might be able to make that happen. And it requires that kind of luck to work in the film business, because it's such an expensive piece of work to make in terms of to learn the craft of filmmaking as a director. The steps are expensive steps because you can't make them alone. So it requires an enormous amount of fortune to be able to get to a position of success, I think. So it's been a long road.
The film that you made, you went to the London Film School, and the film, the first film you made was actually your graduation film. I remember you telling me that you were supposed to make a short film, but you wore them down and made a full length. And that film was very successful, actually, and sort of launched you. Did you feel a lot of pressure at that point? Was it difficult to continue, I suppose, is what I'm asking. After you'd made that, what was the next step? Was there faith in you in the South African filming community?
No. I was making, when I made my first film in 2008 in South Africa, that year South Africa made 12 feature films, and they were all just, you know, genre pieces of work for what they hoped to be a growing audience. And I made a very abstract piece of work about a mother in a slum who's trying to care for her tetraplegic son. The style of the film, the inspiration of that film is, you know, social realist work from Europe that I had been exposed to at film school when I was in London, and so it was a piece of work that audiences in South Africa just had very limited exposure to in terms of understanding a narrative like that, or valuing a narrative like that as entertainment or as a reason to go to the movies. So it was just a sort of like fringe piece of work that had more cultural value in a way, being shown at festivals all around the rest of the world. And then with my second film, which changed everything because it premiered in Cannes, it sort of amplified that, but at the same time, that particular film was banned in 23 African countries because of its sexual politics and the nature of the character and the character's sexuality. So it's always been a disconnect between where I'm from and the things that I've made in South Africa and where it's been sort of celebrated or exhibited, because I've exhibited my, you know, in the film world, in terms of the kind of films that I make, the two exhibition spaces that we all kind of lean toward or need to show our work in is Cannes or Venice. And to show films in those two competitions is extremely difficult because every single filmmaker in the world is trying to get their work in front of those two ultimate curators, being Thierry Frémaux and Alberto Barbara, who choose 20 films every year to put into their collections. And that will change your career as a filmmaker if you're programmed that way. But again, it's such a high-pressure thing. And my third film, The Endless River, was the first South African film to ever be selected for competition in Venice. And again, that sort of gave me more agency and power and opportunity. But it doesn't mean that people in South Africa are any more aware of the work that I do.
And living, ironically, is...
Yes, and then when you make a film with a British movie star and you get nominated for Oscars, then everyone knows who you are.
They know who you are.
Yes.
You know, you raised the issue of sexuality, and this is something I wanted to ask you. If you Google Oliver Hermanus, a lot of what comes up is a sort of identity as a queer filmmaker. And I wondered how you felt about that. You've never really talked about that when we've had conversations, but is that a definition you embrace, resist? How do you feel? You won didn't you win the Queer Palm at Cannes?
Yes.
For Schoonheid? No?
Yes, for
Schoonheid.
I mean, these are just labels. I feel like, you know, I can be the South African filmmaker, I can be the colored South African filmmaker, I can be the queer filmmaker, you can be the award-winning filmmaker, you can be the Academy Award-nominated filmmaker. You know, you're just a filmmaker. And queer as a descriptor for me is the least relevant because not all my work has been about queerness. It's as random as saying straight filmmaker Oliver Hermanus.
Indecisive. Yes. I asked you a little earlier, and I think we sort of got off the topic, about whether there's a thread that you think there are themes in your films that connect, that interest you. You've mostly written or co-written your own films. They've been your projects, your ideas. And I wonder if you see common ground. They're quite different in many ways, but do you see...
I think the interest that I have that evolves, I think as a filmmaker you're always evolving, like any person who works in an artistic art framework, is that, well, for me at least, it feels that the desire always is to make something and then kind of revolt against it or make something else. What I like, I think, thematically across different work is the challenge to an audience of engaging with characters who you might not like or you might not ever meet in reality or never fully understand, and through the subject of a film, you're kind of arresting people's attention and asking them to spend time with somebody that they would never meet in their normal lives, and that seems exciting. That's kind of, you know, and so the more challenging the character is for the audience, the more compromised that character is, or the more denied or oppressed or afraid or whatever that thing is that the character is dealing with as the primary experience of the film, is an exciting thing to sort of excavate. And I think what I've also learned, because the TV show that I'm doing right now is set in 17th century England, is that it's an opportunity for me to learn and to be better at my job, to be better at the sort of very much I work in the entertainment industry kind of attitude of my job. The best people in the film business who do the best work, the most detailed work, the craft, the best craft, are the people that spend most of their lives, learning very rapidly and very diligently. And our costume designer on Living, for example, is the great Sandy Powell. And Sandy Powell, for those of you who don't know, in the film industry is a sort of just the goddess of costume design, because she's just won so many awards. She's won 3 Oscars. She's been nominated for 15 of them or something like that. She's won hundreds of BAFTAs. And she's worked with great artists like Martin Scorsese, etc. And so working with somebody like that, for me, was an invitation to be better. And I think that's the real pressure in the film business, is that you can only survive by innovation.
Yeah. You mentioned that what interests you is imaginatively inhabiting other worlds and other characters. And I wanted to ask you a sort of extension of the question that has been the theme of this conference, which is, can art change things? Can art have a real social impact? And I think film is one of the areas in which, or visually, or TV probably, it can. But
Absolutely.
I wonder what you think, and whether you have any sort of examples to offer of times when you've actually seen that happen.
I mean, we all know that filmmaking and storytelling can have social impact or change, because we've all experienced it. We've all watched movies where it's shifted the way we think about ourselves or our neighbors or our family or our parents, or themes like grief. Films are ways that we imagine our relationships. They become these blueprints of all sorts of things. And when I started, my film Shirley Adams particularly was as the result of my exposure to the Belgian filmmakers, the Dardenne brothers. And the Dardenne brothers are social realist filmmakers working in Belgium, who are great filmmakers of our time. And their work has consistently been about social justice in Belgium. And their work has completely reformed, I think, the way that people, and their work is very popular in Belgium, and also very popular in the curation spaces like Cannes. Those films and their work over the last 20 years has been hugely influential in shifting how Belgian people think about their social welfare system, about immigration. And the Dardennes, their most recent film, has been about the recent immigration laws in Belgium. So there's an obvious connection between filmmaking, storytelling, and being agents of social change.
Have you seen the effect of that in your own work?
Well, because my film Morphe was such an electric wire about toxic masculinity in South Africa and about queerness, because if you were a gay man or gay person in South Africa during apartheid, that was illegal, you were a criminal. And this film is about a young conscript who discovers his sexuality during the army, during apartheid. And I was obviously inundated. You're inundated with people sending you messages, wanting to connect with you because it's their story and because it shifted how they felt about themselves, about their brothers who died, who they never knew were gay. And the power of storytelling is that it allows people the opportunity to engage.
And to empathize.
And to empathize, because you, again, as I said, like there's that arrested ask, that sort of suspension where you ask an audience to spend time with somebody they wouldn't normally spend time with.
We've got about a minute. If anyone has questions for Oliver. Over there, is there a microphone? Okay.
Hi, my name is J.A. Ford. I'm with Cultural Museums. But the question to you, I'm a big fan of the work. We've been in the last 2 days surrounded by a lot of talking. The thing that strikes me about your work is the embracing of silence and the use of ambient sound, as opposed to a lot of talking, a lot of dialogue. The most recent film has a lot more orchestration than I'm accustomed to seeing. But is that a conscious decision on your part, or an economic decision, or just wondering, or does it have any roots in your being a journalist from the beginning?
Yeah, I often get asked why my films are so quiet. I think it's like a personal kind of. I think I'm a visual person, so it's a sort of classic thing of if you can show it, you sort of don't have to say it or tell it. And I like things to evolve visually. It's an interesting thing because of the rise of streaming. They're actually putting more talking in things now because people watch streaming as if it's the radio and they do other things. And so weirdly, if there's a lot of silence in your work, it forces people to actually look at the screen and watch it.
Anyone else? So, I can't see very well.
Hello, Tasneem Salam. Thank you for this really interesting talk. Just sort of wanted to ask, obviously you describe your films as portraiture and perhaps as an agent of change. Do you think about, when you're making a film, do you think about the audience that you want to reach? And would that influence, the way if the film is designed and whatever? Yeah.
Yes, the headspace of a director in the act of making is being a representative of the audience. You're thinking as the audience. You're telling the story to yourself essentially, and imagining how people will see it in sort of en masse. And it's a relationship of respect. It's an assumption that I need to make this worth your while in some sense, challenge you in another way. I think the best films that are made are films that are very interesting and important questions and pose an important question as opposed to providing any answers. So I'm constantly kind of refining my question as I'm directing, hoping that that'll be a valuable question to a group of people in the dark who will leave the cinema and spend a lot of time talking about that question or trying to answer that question or being problematized by that question or reassured by that question. I think that's the success of any film in the kind of films that I make is that experience for an audience.
I think Amos Guitar yesterday used the phrase, I can't remember the exact phrase, but he talked about his filmmaking as an act of disruption. I mean, that sounds like what you are saying here, that the film as question, as provocation.
It has to be provocation. You have to, even if, when I made my living, the reason why I chose to make living, besides, wanting to work with Kazuo Ishiguro, was I'd never made a film about a positive emotion in a sense. I'd never made a film about grief and death in a way that would be an embrace to an audience, because my films have always been more disruptive, and that was the challenge. And so it's a strange feeling when you're sitting in the back of a room in a test screening and you've got 400 people crying en masse at the end of a film because it's so effective emotionally. It's an interesting thing to know that that's the thing that you're fine-tuning as the maker, and that what you've been thinking about, will this affect people? Will they empathize with this character's plight? And then you're experiencing very real emotion in the room.
We're over time, so I have to wrap up, but I'd like to thank Oliver very, very much for this fascinating talk, and thank all of you.